Welcome to Licensed RPGs. Today we'll be discussing Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, released for the Game Boy Color back in November of 2001. While this game represents a rather large and profitable franchise, the game itself seems to suffer from quality issues in the form of a large amount of glitches. So many, in fact, that I feel obligated to dedicate my first section of this review to showing a few of the visual and game-ending glitches that I encountered during my playthrough. You'll notice in this clip that my spell glitches out rather graphically and that the enemy's legs disappear for a short time as well, while the spell is being cast. And in this clip we will notice that my choice indicator has magically vanished. While this doesn't make the game unplayable and only ever occurred in this one battle, it was still a memorable glitch, albeit it pales in comparison to the next one. And finally, in this little gem of a clip, we see me get stuck on a cauldron in Snape's potion class. If you are foolish enough to save at this point in time, you'll be forever trapped here and unable to continue and be forced to start a new save file. But I guess it's finally time I should move on to covering the plot of this game. Plot-wise, the game loosely follows the events of the first book, but does make several changes by either removing, altering, or adding scenes. One of the earliest examples of removal is in this scene where you purchase your wand. In this scene, you'll come to notice that Mr. Alvinder makes no comment on how your wand and He Who Must Not Be Named's wand share a core from the same phoenix. Sadly, this loss of an iconic scene isn't alone. You'll also notice during your charms class that everyone's favorite bushy-haired bookworm doesn't correct Ron's pronunciation on the levitation charm. If the removal of certain iconic scenes wasn't bad enough, their altering of certain scenes can be even more ham-fisted and irritating to someone who feels invested in the series. One of the most glaring examples of this is during your Halloween feast, where Professor Quirrell bursts into the enter hall shouting, "Troll on the first floor! Why isn't it in the dungeon? Why is it on the first floor? Why was this change made? What does it do for the story overall? Nothing. It adds absolutely nothing." Though in my opinion the worst parts are the additional scenes, like Peeves stealing your Christmas presents. These scenes add nothing to the characters and only serve as padding for this relatively short title. On some levels I can understand why changes were made, like the removal of certain scenes in order to streamline the story, or the altering or adding of certain scenes in order to fit in more boss fights, but these changes will only serve to irritate fans who want to play a game that accurately represents the work when it comes to the plot. It's these sorts of things that make me find other games like Yu Yu Hakusho Tournament Tactics so terrible, at least in part, though I guess it is time for them to move on to the gameplay itself. Gameplay-wise, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is a rather simplistic affair and returns to RPG 101 with a turn-based battle system, but utilizes a non-random encounter system despite the claims made by the writers over at IGN. Instead of featuring random encounters, the game includes randomly appearing battle spots on the map that will also fade away over time. This means you remember your 5 Ds of dodgeball. Dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge. You'll be able to avoid battles for the most part, though the game is sometimes a bit cheap by having battle points open up right underneath your character or directly in your path as you try to cross a room. Outside of your standard combat options such as spell, item, or flee, you can also utilize the cards you get out of Chocolate Frogs in combinations of 3 in order to cast powerful spells. Side of the system is a bit undermined by the fact that you'll rarely be able to collect a complete set of 3 on a single playthrough, since the cards you can gather appear to be tied into which deck you selected at the start of the game. And even if this wasn't a factor, the game makes level grinding too easy if you know what you're doing, so you'll never really have a reason to utilize these trump cards in your fight against evil. Outside of combat, the game tends to feel like a where do I go kind of game, since it will routinely toss you rather vague clues or rely on your knowledge of the books or movies in order to advance the game. A good example of this is sometime after Peeves curses you that he reveals that the book that holds the counter curse is hidden in the Muggle Studies room. We only have hints at this by telling you that a Muggle may be studying it. Another example of this is after you get the invisibility cloak and go out for a late night stroll. The game relies on your knowledge of the books or movies in order to know that you need to visit the restricted section. But the most notable aspect of this game may be the inclusion of several minigames in order to distract the player from the rather simplistic and tedious nature of this game. These minigames include crossing the lake, catching Draco on your broom, catching Norbert on your broom, Charms class, a match the card game in the card clubhouse, and capture the flying key minigame. In all honesty, most of these minigames are rather dull, poorly programmed, or useless. A good example of them being useless is the fact that whether you capture Draco or not, this has zero impact on the game. In fact, that minigame is also a good example of how poorly programmed these games can be as well, since you'll basically need to just rush to the front of the screen by holding down the right on the D-pad, and will simply slam into obstacles in your path since you won't have enough time to avoid them. But even if you keep slamming into obstacles, you'll still manage to catch Draco if you keep holding down right on the D-pad. Outside of those minigames, you can also collect potion ingredients on the school grounds and use them in conjunction with the correct cauldron in order to brew potions that can recover your stamina points or magic points. And finally, before I forget, you can also level up your spells by using them enough times in combat. I would have mentioned this earlier, but it has little impact on the game since the only worthwhile level 3 spell is for the Flipendo spell, since it hits all the enemies and do decent damage to almost all of the enemies. And you'll encounter only a few enemies that are highly immune to this spell, such as turtles or certain varieties of spiders. In fact, the Flipendo spell is rather useful even against the most feared Dark Lord in recent memory. Graphically speaking, the game is a rather mixed bag in my opinion. Some of the sprite work is rather well done, but some of it seems of lesser quality. The game also seems to vary a bit in art style as well, with certain character portraits during dialogue scenes having a bit more of a realistic look to them, while other characters have a far more cartoonish appeal. Overall, I don't know how well this game measures up to the graphical capabilities of the Game Boy Color, since this is the first game on the system that I've played in years. And the sound department of the game is rather poor, with an extremely limited number of background music that seems to be comprised of about 3 or 4 songs in total. And sadly, I don't feel like any of the musical scores in this game managed to capture the whimsical feel of the series. Outside of the background music, you do have a few sound effects, but they rarely pop up, so you may not even notice them. In fact, the only one that stands out at all is the following. Overall, I consider this game a rather boring chore that should just be skipped. There are far superior licenses out there that don't skip over important story elements related to controlling a single character. In fact, your inability to use Ron or Harmonia in this game is probably one of its biggest failures. The series is well known for the Golden Trio, so the game should reflect this facet of the narrative after you get to Hogwarts. Giving all the action to Harry cheapens the achievements of the other two that occurred in the book this game is trying to represent, and paying homage to them at the end by still awarding them the house points for what they did in the book does not change my opinion.